Dawn crawled over the American frontier like a wounded beast, dragging long shadows across the plains. The desert breathed in slow, heavy gusts of dust, each one swirling across the land as though the earth itself were whispering warnings to those who dared cross it. Sagebrush trembled beneath the early light, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Far-off canyon spires glowed red as embers, jutting into the sky like the bones of giants long buried beneath the sand. The wind carried a dry whistle, weaving through jagged rock and dying grass, telling stories of riders, gun smoke, and old ghosts. This was a land where silence had weight, where every hoofbeat cracked open the stillness like a warning shot. Coyotes watched from distant ridges, their yellow eyes following the shifting horizon as though expecting something to rise from it. Something old, something feared, something returning. At the edge of this vast quiet stood a small, weathered ranch that had seen more storms than most men could remember. A lone woman moved slowly within its fences, her frame steady despite the years carved into it. She had been known once as May Hartwell, the ranch woman who never bent, never begged, and never bowed to anyone's intimidation. Folks respected her not because she was loud, but because she survived, through droughts, through losses, through the unforgiving winters that cracked the land open. Her ranch was modest, a simple house of rough-hewn timber, a barn leaning slightly with age, a well she had drawn from since the day her husband died. The place breathed of quiet strength, but beneath its silence lived a loneliness she never admitted aloud. Each morning she walked the same path across her yard, checking the chickens, running her hand across the porch railing that her son had carved years before he disappeared into the world with no goodbye. She spoke little, prayed rarely, and trusted no one, but the land trusted her. The stillness around her home felt safe, preserved, like the world held its breath when she stepped outside. But that morning, the silence felt wrong. The breeze was too sharp. The air carried a tension she had no name for, but her bones recognized it. Something was coming. Something she had prayed never would. The first rider emerged from a cloud of dust like a serpent lifting its head. Then another. And another. 5 in total. Outlaws. She could see it even from the distance, in their tilted hats, their careless posture, the way their horses trotted sideways as though feeding off the men's hunger for trouble. They stopped at her gate as though they'd arrived at a place they owned. May stood firm on her porch, hand steady though her pulse beat like a trapped bird's wings. The leader dismounted first, boots hitting the ground with a thud that made the chickens scatter. His grin was wide and rotten. "Mornin', ma'am," he drawled, though his eyes carried no politeness. "Heard you're sittin' on supplies folks like us could use." May didn't answer. The truth was simple. She had no supplies worth stealing. But men like these didn't come to take what existed. They came to take what wasn't theirs. Another outlaw walked past her toward the barn, kicking over a feed bucket just to hear the metal clang. "Ain't much here," he muttered. "Old woman's been holding out." They pushed into her home, shoulder slamming the door open so hard it cracked. She tried to stop them, but a rough hand shoved her aside. Inside, they tore through cabinets, drawers, shelves, leaving destruction in their wake. Her mother's dishes shattered on the floor. Her husband's old rifle was taken. Her blankets ripped open as though she hid gold beneath the seams. When she insisted there was nothing to give, the leader struck her with the back of his hand, hard enough to send her crashing into the porch railing. Pain exploded through her ribs, her vision blurring. She tried to rise, but a boot pressed her down. Her breath rattled as they mocked her, cursed her, called her a liar. They left her house ruined, windows cracked, furniture broken, shelves torn from the wall. Before leaving, the leader crouched beside her, letting his shadow fall over her like a curtain. "Should have just given us what you had," he whispered. "But someone like you, stubborn as a mule. Reckon that's why your boy ran off." When they rode away, May was left in the dirt, the world pulsing in and out of focus. Her breath came thin and shaky. She touched the splintered railing, the place her son had carved when he was just a boy, his initials still visible beneath the dust. She clung to them like they were her last tether to life. Hours passed in a haze. The sun sank lower, bleeding red across the sky. The quiet returned, but it was not the same quiet she had known. This one felt hollow, broken, a silence that mourned. Then came the distant echo of hooves. Slow, steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat approaching from the far edge of the world. A dark figure crossed the horizon, moving through the settling dusk with a purpose carved into every line of his posture. His horse was a black stallion, tall and restless beneath him, But the rider held the reins with a calm that didn't belong to ordinary men. He rode as though he knew the land better than he knew breath, as though every canyon shadow and desert breeze bowed slightly when he passed. Stories had been told about a man who moved like that. Stories murmured in saloons when the whiskey ran low and the fear ran high. Stories of an outlaw who vanished years ago but left behind a trail of men who still woke screaming his name. The rider slowed as he neared the ranch. His eyes swept across the yard, taking in the broken gate, the scattered debris, the barn door left swinging like a wounded limb. His jaw tightened, the muscle flickering beneath skin marked by years of dust, scars, and battles the law never heard about. Then he saw her. May lay against the railing, breath shallow, eyes half open but unfocused. He dismounted instantly, boots hitting the earth with silent urgency. Kneeling beside her, he touched her shoulder gently, his voice cracking in a way it had not in years. "Mama." Her lips trembled, barely able to shape his name. She tried to lift a hand toward his face, the son she hadn't seen in so long she feared she'd forgotten the shape of him. But he caught her hand before it fell, pressing it to his cheek, breath-breaking. "Who did this?" he whispered. Her voice was a brittle thread, weaving in and out like a memory that didn't want to leave the world. She told him what little she could. Men with cruel eyes, a leader with a scar across his jaw, laughter that sounded like a rattler's shake. She couldn't remember names, only shadows, but those shadows were enough. His expression changed. The grief in his eyes hardened into something sharper, colder, something the West hadn't seen in a long time. He carried her inside with careful strength, laying her on the only unbroken bed. He tended her wounds as best he could, hands steady despite the storm building beneath his skin. Her breathing steadied, but barely. She squeezed his hand once, weak, but full of trust, before slipping into a fragile sleep. He stood, looking at the wreckage of the home he once knew. Shelves ripped open, blood on the porch, footprints of men who didn't fear God or law, but they should have feared him. He stepped outside as the full moon rose, its pale light casting long shadows across the ruined yard. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the outlaw's trail. He recognized it instantly. Dust, sweat, smoke, the distinct smell of men who believed themselves untouchable. A slow breath filled his chest, but it did nothing to cool the fire burning inside him. He reached for the revolver at his hip, the same gun he had sworn never to draw again. The metal felt heavier now, older, but it still hummed with the same deadly promise. The land held its breath as he mounted his horse. That night, the narrator would say years later, the West remembered his name, and why men once trembled when they heard it. He stayed beside his mother through the long night, keeping the lamp low so its trembling glow wouldn't disturb her fragile breathing. He cleaned the cuts on her cheek, wrapped her ribs tight where bruises swelled purple, and fed her spoonfuls of water when she stirred. Every movement he made felt like penance. He had left her years ago with the foolish belief that distance would keep danger from her doorstep. He had walked away from the ranch carrying anger, grief, and a name that men whispered in fear. Now he knelt at her bedside, realizing the cost of every mile placed between them. Her fingers twitched weakly against his wrist, reminding him of every letter he never sent, every promise he never fulfilled. Dawn crept along the window frame, its light pale and cold, touching her face with a softness he didn't deserve. He wiped a tear from her cheek that wasn't hers but his, then tucked the blanket higher over her shoulders. When he rose, something inside him shifted, a heavy iron burden settling into place. Guilt sharpened into resolve. The past could not be undone, but the men responsible for this would not see another sunrise. He looked at her once more before stepping outside, whispering a vow to return to her whole, or not at all. The early morning air tasted of dust and old sorrow as he mounted his horse. The tracks the gang left behind were still fresh, carved into the earth like claw marks. Broken fence posts leaned like crooked gravestones along the property's edge, and the ground bore the signs of hooves moving fast and reckless. He followed the trail toward the open plains, guiding his horse carefully around churned soil and scattered debris. A neighbor's ranch lay half a mile east, and even from afar he could sense the tension. A ranch hand stared from the porch, eyes wide, gripping a shotgun that shook in his trembling hands. When the outlaw approached, the men flinched, unsure whether to run or pray. But the outlaw only asked one question, voice low and controlled. The ranch hand nodded quickly, stammering that he'd seen riders tearing through the night, spooking cattle, and shouting threats. Farther along, he found another sign, skid marks where a wagon had been forced aside, its wheel smashed. A woman stood beside the wreck, clutching her shawl close. She shrank back when she saw him, but her gaze softened as she noticed the storm behind his eyes. She pointed eastward, confirming the gang had passed through with no mercy or reason. Each witness added another stone to the weight inside his chest. Every broken fence, every frightened face, every whispered warning tightened the thread of fury pulling him forward. He felt himself slipping into the man he once was, a tracker so relentless the desert seemed to yield its secrets rather than defy him. By noon, he reached the outskirts of a small town, Dry Bend, a place he had avoided for nearly a decade. The buildings looked older, the signs more faded, but the air still carried the same mix of dust, sweat, and secrets. As he rode down the street, conversations died instantly. Men froze mid-step. Women guiding their children inside did so with nervous urgency. He dismounted in front of the saloon, its swinging doors creaking in the wind, as though the structure itself recognized him and trembled. Inside, the room fell silent, every pair of eyes turning his way. Some showed fear, some respect, and some old grudges, but no one dared speak first. The bartender swallowed hard, wiping an already clean glass. The outlaw approached the counter with a calm that felt carved from stone. He didn't need to ask. His presence alone was enough to loosen tongues. A man at a corner table muttered that the gang had passed through just before dawn, loud and drunk, bragging about a ranch raid. Another added that their leader carried a scar across his jaw, a description the outlaw recognized painfully well. Whispers spread quickly, like ripples on dark water. Someone mentioned Dead Horse Canyon. Heads bowed when the outlaw's expression darkened. He could feel the room's unease thickening, but none dared challenge him. Even after years away, his shadow still stretched across these people's memories. The saloon seemed to exhale only after he turned toward the door. As he stepped back outside, a quiet voice stopped him. A widow stood beneath the awning, clutching a basket of supplies. Her face was lined with grief, but her eyes held a steady courage. She told him she had seen the outlaws ride southeast, kicking dust toward Dead Horse Canyon, their laughter echoing like wolves. She described their numbers, the distinct horse of their leader, and the way they moved with the confidence of men who had forgotten what consequences felt like. She hesitated before adding one more detail, something she almost didn't share. She had seen one of them carrying a piece of cloth torn from a woman's shawl. The outlaw's breath hitched, but he thanked her with a nod that carried more sincerity than most words could. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, saying quietly that whatever he sought at the canyon, he might not return from it. His silence told her he understood. He rode off before she could say more. The road south stretched long and unbroken, giving his thoughts room to surge. Memories he'd buried deep clawed their way to the surface. He saw flashes of his younger years, the violence he unleashed, the lawmen he outran, the gunfights that stained his name into legend. He remembered nights where whiskey dulled the roar inside him, days where the sun burned his guilt deeper into his skin. There had been a time when no outlaw in the territory dared cross him. No sheriff dared pursue him without a small army. He had been a storm given human shape, fastest with a revolver, deadliest when cornered, feared even by men who prided themselves on fearing nothing. But the worst memories were of his mother, tears in her eyes the night he left, begging him to lay down the gun before it consumed him. He had ignored her then, hungry for a name the world would remember. He earned that name, but the cost had been steep, too steep. Now that same name, once feared across saloons and sheriff's offices, would be the blade he turned on the men who broke her. The sun dipped lower as he rode, the sky bleeding orange and purple along the canyon's jagged edge. The closer he drew to Dead Horse Canyon, the heavier the air became, as though the land itself braced for violence. The canyon walls rose like sentinels, ancient and silent, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers toward him. His horse grew restless beneath him, sensing the shift in the wind, the metallic tang of danger, the lingering echo of distant hoofbeats. He slowed, dismounting to study the ground. Tracks led straight into the narrow throat of the canyon, where the shadows swallowed the last of daylight. A chill crept across the desert floor as night descended, wrapping the world in a cold stillness that felt like the breath before a storm. He adjusted his hat, tightened the strap of his holster, and walked forward with deliberate steps. The canyon swallowed light, sound, and warmth, leaving only the faint rustle of wind against stone. Every instinct sharpened, every sense awakened. The trail ahead was narrow, winding, and unforgiving. Perfect ground for an ambush, perfect ground for a reckoning. The outlaw paused for a heartbeat, listening to the night. Somewhere ahead, the gang camped with stolen confidence. Somewhere ahead, The man with the scar laughed, unaware that death rode behind him. He stepped into the canyon's dark embrace, eyes narrowed, breath steady, and the desert whispered along the stone walls, carrying his name like an old prophecy returning to claim its due. The canyon swallowed him whole as he stepped deeper into its winding throat, the world narrowing into a corridor of stone and shadow. Moonlight spilled down the cliff walls in silver ribbons, tracing ancient veins carved by centuries of wind and forgotten rivers. Every sound was magnified, the crunch of gravel under his boots, the low whistle of the breeze slipping through cracks, the distant cry of a lone coyote that echoed like a warning across the rocks. The air cooled sharply as he moved forward, smelling of dust, sage, and something faintly metallic, the scent of men who'd camped here recently. The canyon walls towered overhead like the ribs of some massive beast, closing him into a world where silence felt alive. His footsteps slowed, eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow. He felt the weight of the moon on his back, a cold guardian watching over him as he followed the faint trail deeper, knowing each step tugged him closer to the men who'd shattered his only family. He paused when a loose pebble skittered down the cliff face, rolling across the path. The noise was too sharp, too sudden. His hand drifted toward his holster, fingers brushing the familiar grip. Before he could draw, two figures lunged from opposite sides of the canyon, their breath sharp, footsteps quick, guns glinting. The ambush came fast, efficient, confident, clearly the work of men who believed no one could survive it. The first scout leaped toward him with a knife, swinging downward in a wide arc meant to split him open. The outlaw sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, twisted sharply, and heard the blade clatter against the stone. In the same motion, he drove an elbow into the man's ribs, sending him crashing to the ground. The second scout fired a shot that cracked against the canyon walls like thunder. The outlaw dropped to one knee, rolled behind a jutting boulder, and drew his revolver. Another shot rang out, sparks flying as a bullet struck the stone beside his head. He inhaled once, slow and steady, focusing his senses until the world shrank into a single point, the shooter's breath echoing faintly from 10 yards ahead. He rose swiftly and fired. The bullet struck the scout's shoulder, spinning him backward. The man's gun slipped from his hand, skittering across the gravel. Before he could reach it, the outlaw closed the distance with long, sure strides and kicked the weapon aside. The first scout groaned, trying to crawl away, but a quick sweep of the outlaw's boot stopped him cold. Both attackers lay defeated within moments, the kind of efficiency only years of violence could teach. He stood over them, breath steady, heart calm, as though his body remembered this rhythm all too well. The moon cast a pale glow on his face, sculpting the hard lines born from battles he'd hoped were behind him. But tonight, mercy was not a luxury he carried. He knelt beside the wounded scout who'd taken the bullet. The man's breathing was ragged, eyes wide with a fear that grew with every second. The outlaw leaned closer, voice low, steady as stone. "Who sent you?" The scout tried to spit, but pain stole the attempt. His hand pressed uselessly against the bleeding shoulder. The outlaw's gaze didn't waver. "Talk," he said quietly, "or the canyon will bury your bones before dawn." The man's jaw shook. He winced. "We was guarding the pass," Tate said. "Tate said no one gets through." The outlaw's expression hardened at the name. Marshal Tate. A ghost he'd hoped never to see again. The scout continued, breath hitching. "He's camped deeper in, near the old mining pit. Said to watch for anyone following, especially you." The outlaw's eyes narrowed. "He knows I'm coming." "He hoped," the scout croaked, "you'd be fool enough." The outlaw stood slowly, the cliff shadows swallowing half his face. Tate's name struck him like an old wound reopening, one he'd carried for years beneath the silence of his exile. He left the scout where he lay, knowing the wound would keep him from moving far before dawn. The canyon air felt colder now, but not from the night. It was the past rising like a specter, demanding to be faced. He continued forward, deeper into the winding passageways of stone, each step stirring memories he'd buried long ago. He saw himself younger, angrier, standing in this very canyon once before. Tate's voice echoed faintly in his mind, the mocking tone, the smug laugh, the cruel command that had nearly cost him everything. His mother's face appeared next, filled with terror the day Tate confronted them. She had stood between them, trembling but refusing to move aside, protecting her son from a man who wore authority like a weapon. Tate had spit at her feet, gun drawn, ready to shoot the outlaw where he stood. She had taken the first blow meant for her son, buying him the breath he needed to escape. That scar, the one Tate carried across his jaw, had been left by the outlaw's knife as he fled into the night. He remembered the look Tate gave him as blood dripped onto the dirt, promise of vengeance burning brighter than the desert sun. He thought he'd escaped Tate's reach by disappearing. He thought he'd spared his mother by leaving her behind. But Tate had never forgotten. And now May Hartwell had paid the price for a grudge that should have died years ago. The memory burned at his chest as he neared the end of the canyon. The path widened into a valley choked with dead trees and scattered boulders, the ground littered with old mining equipment rusted by time. Smoke curled upward from behind a large ridge, thin, almost invisible, but unmistakably the trail of a campfire. He crouched behind a fallen log and studied the scene below. Half a dozen horses were tied near a crooked pine, their ears flicking restlessly as though sensing the violence to come. The gang's tents were arranged haphazardly around the fire, charred logs crackling beneath the fading flame. He counted 7 men moving about, 5 drinking and laughing near the fire, 2 pacing the perimeter with rifles slung low. Their faces flickered in the firelight, rough silhouettes of cruelty carved by years of lawless living. And sitting slightly apart, sharpening a long hunting knife with deliberate strokes, was Marshal Tate. He looked older, leaner, but his posture still radiated arrogance. The firelight cast a demonic glow on his scarred jaw, the same mark left by the outlaw's desperate slash years before. Tate lifted his face slightly, as though sensing a familiar presence riding the night wind, and smirked. The outlaw tightened the grip on his revolver, but he didn't move yet. Not until he had studied every angle, every path. The valley lay in a bowl of stone, giving the gang the illusion of safety, but also providing him with shadows deep enough to move like a phantom. He watched the guards' pacing patterns, the moments when their rifles dipped lazily. He noted which men were drunkest, whose reactions would be slowest, where the horses might stampede if startled. He took in the distance between the tents, the stacks of supplies that could explode if a bullet struck them, the narrow side trail that offered a route of escape, or a trap. Every detail mattered. Every breath had to be measured. Tonight's battle was not a brawl born of rage. It was a reckoning shaped by purpose. He lowered himself behind the log, inhaling deeply as moonlight washed over the barren valley. His heartbeat slowed, settling into a rhythm he hadn't felt in years, a quiet, deadly calm. The desert around him felt still, waiting, as though the land itself leaned in to witness the judgment about to unfold. He checked the revolver, spun its cylinder with a soft click, then holstered it. His knife shone faintly in the moonlight. His jaw clenched, not out of fear, but out of the certainty that he would not leave this canyon until Tate's shadow no longer haunted the world. He whispered a promise to the night, one meant for his mother, meant for the boy he once was, meant for the land that raised him. Then he rose slowly from the cover of darkness, ready to step into the valley where fate waited like a loaded gun. Dawn crept slowly over the outlaw camp, washing the valley in a pale, muted glow. The fire had burned down to a thin line of ember, casting the gang's tents in long, trembling shadows. Horses stood restless, stamping at the hard earth as though they sensed the storm waiting in the silence. A thin wind glided through the canyon, carrying the scent of ash and sweat, whispering between the rocks like a warning that went unheard by the men sleeping below. Marshal Tate sat hunched on a log, head bowed, blade resting across his knee. He had dozed off beside the dying fire, unaware that the darkness around him was shifting, tightening, preparing to swallow him whole. The outlaw crouched above on a narrow ridge, his silhouette perfectly still against the first rays of light. He watched each breath rising from the camp, counted the positions of every man, and let the weight of the moment settle deep into his bones. The world below was quiet, too quiet, as though the land itself anticipated blood. A single stone rolled loose from his boot and slipped down the slope, striking another rock with a faint click. A guard glanced up, squinting toward the ridge, but before he could raise his rifle, a gunshot cracked through the valley. The bullet struck clean through the guard's chest, sending him tumbling backward into the dust. Chaos erupted instantly. Men scrambled from their tents, shouting, grabbing guns and knives, tripping over each other as the outlaw descended the ridge like a shadow torn from a cliffside. His revolver flashed once, twice, 3 times, each shot deliberate, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. One outlaw dropped beside the horses, another fell while reaching for a rifle, and a third barely rose before collapsing with a choke groan. Tate jerked awake, startled by the sudden violence. His eyes widened as he recognized the figure cutting through his men like a force of nature. "You!" he snarled, reaching for his gun. The outlaw didn't answer. He moved through the smoke and dust with silent fury, closing the distance. When one of Tate's men lunged at him with a knife, the outlaw deflected the strike with his forearm, grabbed the man's wrist, and drove him face first into the embers of the dying fire. Another charged from behind, swinging a rifle like a club, but the outlaw spun and fired from the hip, sending the men sprawling lifeless into the dirt. Tate fired a shot that grazed the outlaw's shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin. Pain flared, but he didn't stop. He dove behind a pile of old mining crates, bullets splintering the wood beside him. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood. Tate cursed loudly, firing again and again, each shot filled with years of hate. "Should have killed you when I had the chance," he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The outlaw rose from cover, firing with cold, measured calm. Tate ducked behind a wagon, returning fire with reckless rage. Wood shattered, dust swirled, and tension wound itself tighter around the shrinking space between them. The outlaw moved closer, step by step, until Tate's wild gunfire forced him behind a boulder. The final shot from Tate's revolver clicked empty. Silence fell for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, the outlaw stepped out. But before he could fire, another gunshot tore through the air, aimed at him, not Tate. One of the gang's surviving men, hiding behind an overturned barrel, had taken aim at the outlaw's exposed side. The outlaw turned too late. He saw the muzzle flare, heard the crack, felt the world narrow. The bullet never reached him. A second gunshot struck first. The hidden shooter collapsed backward, a clean hole between his eyes. The outlaw blinked, stunned for only a moment, before his instincts took over and he dodged behind cover. A figure emerged from the canyon mist, an older cowboy, gray-haired and narrow-shouldered, riding a mule that looked nearly as worn as he was. His rifle rested steady across his arm, smoke still rising from the barrel. The outlaw stared at him in disbelief. "Thought you might need a hand," the old cowboy said, voice dry as the desert. "Your mother sent me once before. Reckon she ain't too proud to do it again." Before the outlaw could respond, the old cowboy slipped off the mule and reloaded calmly, as though he were preparing for a day's hunt rather than a violent reckoning. Tate's eyes grew wild when he realized reinforcements had arrived. He fired blindly in their direction, but the old cowboy stepped aside with slow, practiced ease and fired back. His shot clipped Tate's gun hand, sending the weapon flying. Tate screamed, clutching his bleeding fingers. The outlaw's rage surged. The memory of his mother lying broken on the porch flashed behind his eyes, fueling every step he took as he advanced on Tate. The old cowboy hung back, watching with grim understanding, as though knowing this moment belonged to the outlaw alone. Tate stumbled away, backing against a jagged boulder. "Wait, wait!" he gasped, raising his good hand in surrender. His voice shook for the first time in years. "Listen, I didn't mean to hurt her that bad. It was just to scare her. That's all. You know how it is. You know this life." The outlaw paused only long enough to see the truth in Tate's eyes, that there was no remorse, only fear of the bullet he knew was coming. "You should have stayed away from her," the outlaw said softly. Tate shook his head violently. "Please, I'll leave the territory. I'll disappear. No one has to." The outlaw fired once. Tate crumpled, sliding down the rock until his body went still. The canyon echoed with a shot for a long moment, as though the land itself wanted to repeat the sound, memorizing the end of a man who had caused too much suffering for too long. The old cowboy approached slowly, the mule trailing behind him. "Your mother would have wanted justice," he said quietly. "Reckon she'd say you delivered it clean." The outlaw nodded, though the weight of everything pressed heavy on his shoulders, the blood on his hands, the years he'd run, the pain he couldn't erase. "Why'd you follow me?" he asked. The old cowboy shrugged. "Because that woman once fed me when I was starving. Patched up my leg when no one else would. Folks forget kindness easy. I don't." Something eased inside the outlaw. Not quite peace, but something close. He looked around the camp, lifeless, silent now, and knew it was time to leave this place behind. When he returned home, the sun had risen fully, casting warm light across the battered ranch. His mother sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, weaker but awake. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and tears traced the lines of her weathered cheeks. He knelt beside her, resting his forehead gently against hers. "It's done," he whispered. Later, when word spread, the townsfolk whispered the tale in hushed voices. They spoke of the man who rode into the canyon alone, the storm that followed him, the judgment delivered without hesitation. They spoke of the old cowboy who appeared like a ghost to guard him. They spoke of Tate's end, and the ranch woman who survived the cruelty meant to break her. But most of all, they spoke of the outlaw's name, spoke it with a mixture of fear and respect, as though it were a warning carved into the land itself. Because now the West remembered him, and it would not forget again.